The smell of incense was still in the air when bitch said it. You don't understand, do you? This house was never really yours. You just lived here because my brother let you. Now he's gone, and so is your reason to stay. She said it standing right beside the ancestral altar, where the smoke from 3 thin sticks of incense was still curling upward, where my husband's photograph watched us both from inside its dark wooden frame. The neighbors who had come for the death anniversary were still sitting on the wooden benches along the wall, their bowls of chai in their laps, their chopsticks frozen mid-air. Nobody moved, nobody breathed too loudly. I did not answer her. I looked at the incense instead, the way it bent slightly to the left, pushed by a draft slipping in through the gap under the door. The afternoon light came through the wooden shutters in thin gold lines, falling across the tile floor in stripes, across my husband's photograph, across bitch's flushed, triumphant face. I smiled. Not a wide smile. Just a small lift at the corner of my mouth, the kind of smile a teacher gives a student who has answered confidently but wrongly and doesn't yet know it. Someone coughed. Mrs. Sow, my neighbor for almost 40 years, looked at me with her eyebrows drawn together, silently asking the question everyone in that room was asking. Why isn't she saying anything? Why isn't she fighting back? I had been a teacher for 31 years. I had stood in front of unruly classrooms full of children who thought silence meant weakness, who thought a teacher's stillness meant she had run out of answers. I had learned, long before I ever stood in this house as a bride, that silence is not empty. Silence is where you keep the things you are not ready to spend yet. 3 months. That is how long it had been since bitch started coming to this house more often than she ever had while my husband was alive. 3 months of her sweet, careful suggestions disguised as concern. Sister, you're getting older. You should let the children's names go on the papers too, just to make things easier later. Sister, why carry all this responsibility alone? Let me help you with the paperwork. I know people who can make it simple. I had nodded each time. I had poured her tea each time. And each time, after she left, I had walked quietly to the wooden altar table, knelt down, and checked the small tin box hidden beneath the lowest drawer, the one that had belonged to my husband's grandmother. Before it ever belonged to me, it was still there. It was always still there. But today, Bick had not come with sweet suggestions. Today she had come with a folder of papers, and a man I did not recognize standing slightly behind her in the doorway, dressed in a shirt too clean and shoes too polished for a death anniversary. Today she had not asked. She had announced. The incense kept burning. The smoke kept rising in its same slow spiral, indifferent to the silence stretching across the room like a held breath. I looked again at my husband's photograph, at his calm, unbothered face, the same face he wore the morning he told me, years ago, before he passed, Lan, water that runs quiet is always the deepest. Don't ever let anyone mistake your silence for an empty well. I had not understood it then. I understood it now, standing in front of his sister, in front of his altar, in front of strangers who thought they had already won. Let her speak first, I thought. Let her show everyone exactly who she is, before I show anyone what I have. The incense bent again in the draft, and somewhere outside, a moped passed on the dirt road, the sound of its engine fading into the late afternoon quiet, leaving only the smell of smoke and the sound of my own steady breathing, the only sound now in the room. Before any of this, there was simply a house and a life inside it that I had built one careful year at a time. My name is Lan. I was a literature teacher for 31 years at the secondary school, 3 kilometers from this house. The same house my husband Huang inherited from his father, and his father before him. I taught children to read poetry properly, to feel the weight of a single well-placed word, to understand that the things left unsaid in a sentence often carried more meaning than the things written down. I did not know then that I would spend the later years of my life applying that same lesson to people instead of paragraphs. Huang and I married when I was 23. He was a quiet man, broad-shouldered, with hands rough from years of farming the small plot of land behind the house before he later worked as a clerk at the district office. He did not say "Ma, Han you," quote, "I want it to hold hours too." I had touched the wooden doorframe, worn smooth by decades of hands, and felt something settle quietly inside my chest, a feeling I would later understand as belonging. We never had children of our own. We tried for years, visited doctors in the city, burned incense, and prayed at 3 different temples, and eventually accepted what could not be changed. Huang never once made me feel less for it. We have each other, he would say, and we have this house. That is enough of a family for me. I believed him completely. His mother lived with us until she passed. An elderly woman with sharp eyes who, in her final years, would sit on the wooden bench by the window each afternoon, watching the road. Bic, Hong's younger sister, married young, and moved 3 towns over, visiting only a handful of times a year, usually around holidays, usually leaving with something in her bag that had not been there when she arrived. A bag of rice, a jar of fish sauce, sometimes money folded carefully into an envelope that Hoang would press into her hand at the door, telling her not to mention it to her husband. I never resented those visits. I understood. In the quiet way, one understands the shape of a family without anyone ever explaining it aloud. That bitch had always felt like the forgotten child, the daughter who left while the son stayed, the one who watched her brother inherit a house and a name, while she carried only a dowry into a marriage that, from what little she shared, was not particularly kind to her. Hoang built a small altar room at the back of the house for his parents, and later, I helped him build the larger one in the main room, the one where we would eventually place his own photograph. He used to stand in front of it each evening, lighting incense, speaking softly to his parents about the small details of the day, the rice harvest, the leaking roof we finally repaired, the new bicycle I bought for a student who could not afford one. Keep this house standing, he told them, and keep it gentle. I did not understand, at the time, how literally I would one day need to follow that instruction. 3 years ago, Hoang's heart gave out one quiet morning in early spring. While he was watering the small garden behind the kitchen, I found him there, kneeling among the morning glory vines, as if he had simply decided to rest. The doctors said there was nothing anyone could have done, that these things happen without warning, like a sudden change in weather. After the funeral, after the 49 days of prayers, after the visitors stopped coming with their condolences and their trays of fruit, the house grew very quiet. I kept his side of the bed exactly as it was. I kept his sandals by the door. I lit incense every morning and every evening, the same way he had, speaking softly to him about the small details of my day, as if he could still hear me, as if the smoke carrying upward might still reach wherever he had gone. It was during this quiet, this long stretch of mourning, that bitch began visiting more frequently. At first, I was grateful. I thought, perhaps, grief had finally brought us closer, 2 women who had loved the same man in different ways, both left now to carry his memory forward together. I did not yet understand that grief, in some people, does not soften the heart. Sometimes it simply reveals, very clearly, what was already underneath. The first time Bic brought up the papers, she did it so gently I almost did not notice what she was actually asking. It was a Sunday afternoon in early autumn, the kind of day when the heat had finally started to loosen its grip, when the wind carried the smell of burning rice husks from somewhere down the road. She arrived unannounced, carrying a bag of dragon fruit, smiling the wide, practiced smile she always wore when she wanted something. "Sister Lan," she said, settling onto the wooden bench across from me, peeling a dragon fruit with quick, efficient movements. "I've been thinking about you a lot. Living here all alone, in this big house. It must be lonely. I have my students who visit. And the neighbors," I said, pouring her tea. Yes, of course." She waved a hand, dismissing the thought as quickly as she had raised it. "But I mean, practically speaking, what happens if something happens to you? God forbid, of course, but you're not young anymore, sister. Who would handle the house? The paperwork? It would be such a burden for anyone to sort out." I said nothing, only watched the way her eyes moved briefly toward the altar room, toward the wooden cabinet beneath it, before returning to my face. "I was thinking," she continued, her voice softening into something that almost sounded like genuine concern. Maybe it would be easier if we added a few names to the property papers. Mine, perhaps. Just so that if anything happens, there's no confusion, no trouble with the authorities. It would protect you, really, protect the house. I smiled at her then, the same small smile I would later give her in front of the entire room of mourners. The house is registered properly, bitch. There's no confusion. Her smile flickered. Just barely, before she recovered it. Of course. I only meant to help. You know how complicated these government offices can be for someone your age. I changed the subject, asked about her husband's health, about her son's job in the city, and she allowed the conversation to drift, though I noticed, as she left that evening, the way her eyes lingered one more time on the altar room before she stepped through the door. The visits continued through the following months, each one carrying the same quiet suggestion, dressed in slightly different clothing. Sometimes it was about taxes. Sometimes it was about a cousin who had recently lost a family home in a legal dispute. A story told with great concern, but always circling back to the same conclusion. Wouldn't it be safer, sister, to have more than one name on the papers? Each time, I said no, gently, the way I once redirected a student who had wandered too far from the lesson. Each time, bitch accepted the refusal with grace on the surface, though I began to notice something tightening behind her eyes, something that had not been there during her earlier visits, in the months right after Hoang's passing. Then, in early spring, almost exactly a year after Hoang died, she arrived with a different kind of energy altogether. She did not bring fruit. She did not ask about my health or my students. She came directly to the point, sitting stiffly across from me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Sister, I need to ask you something important. Have you ever considered selling part of the land? Just the back portion, where the old garden is. There's a businessman interested. He's offering very good money. It could help both of us. This land belongs to your brother's family line, bitch. It's not mine to sell, and it's not for sale. It's exactly yours to sell, she snapped, the gentleness finally cracking apart like dry mud in the sun. You're the one living here, enjoying the house, the land, everything, while the rest of us struggle. My brother is gone. Why should everything just sit here collecting dust under your name? I did not raise my voice. I never do. Because it was his wish that this house stay as it is. And because it is registered under my name, legally, completely. There is no dust collecting, bitch. There is simply a house, doing exactly what it was built to do. She stood up so quickly, her chair scraped hard against the tile floor, and for a moment, I saw something in her face I had never seen in all the years I had known her, something sharp and hungry, quickly hidden again behind an apologetic smile. I'm sorry, sister. I didn't mean to upset you. Forget I said anything. She left soon after, the dragon fruit she had not brought conspicuously absent from her excuse for visiting at all. I sat alone in the quiet house that evening, lighting incense as I always did, watching the thin smoke rise and curl toward the dark wooden beams of the ceiling. I did not know, not yet, exactly what bitch intended to do, but I had spent 31 years reading the small, careful signs that students give right before they attempt something they know is wrong. The shifting eyes, the rehearsed explanations, the sudden interest in things that had never mattered before. I walked to the altar room, knelt down in front of the lowest drawer of the old wooden cabinet, and opened the small tin box hidden beneath it. The papers were still there, exactly where they had always been. I held them for a long moment in the dim evening light, feeling their familiar weight in my hands, before placing them carefully back and closing the drawer. Whatever bitch was planning, I thought, she would need more than sweet words and dragon fruit to take what was never hers to take. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early summer, slipped under the front gate sometime before dawn, wedged between the metal bars, where the postman usually left bills and notices from the commune office. I almost did not notice it at first. I was busy sweeping the front yard, the bamboo broom moving in slow, familiar strokes across the swept dirt, when my neighbor Mrs. Sal called out from across the narrow lane, her voice carrying the particular sharpness of someone who has news she is both eager and afraid to share. Sister Lan. Sister Lan. Come look at this. She was standing near the gate, pointing at something taped to the wooden post beside it. A printed notice with an official-looking stamp in the corner. I set down my broom and walked over, my heart already tightening before I had even read a single word. Notice of property. Under mortgage review, it read, followed by a string of legal language I had to read twice to fully absorb. The bank's name, a property address, my address, a loan amount that made my hands go cold around the edges of the paper. What is this? Mrs. Sow asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected something was deeply wrong. Sister, did you take out a loan? Did you mortgage the house? No, I said quietly, my eyes scanning the document again, searching for some explanation that would make sense of what I was reading. I did not take out any loan. I walked quickly back inside, the notice trembling slightly in my hand, and pulled out the small wooden box where I kept my identification papers, my bank documents, the few important things I had accumulated over a lifetime of careful living. Everything appeared exactly as it should. My bank account, modest but untouched. My identification card, exactly where I always kept it. But the notice was real. The bank's letterhead was real. The property address was correct, down to the smallest detail, including the small alley number. Only someone with access to official records would know. I sat at the wooden table in the kitchen for a long time, the morning light slowly shifting across the floor as the sun climbed higher. The notice spread out in front of me like a puzzle. I did not yet have all the pieces to solve. Who had access to information about this house detailed enough to file something like this? Who would even think to attempt it? I thought of Bick's visits over the past year, the dragon fruit, the gentle suggestions about adding names to the papers, the sudden interest in selling the back portion of the land, the way her eyes had lingered, every single time, on the altar room, on the wooden cabinet, on the drawer she did not know contained anything more than old photographs and incense supplies. I thought, too, of a detail I had nearly forgotten, something so small it had barely registered as important at the time. 6 months ago, Bitch had asked to borrow my old photocopy of the property registration, claiming she needed it to help process some unrelated paperwork at the commune office for her son's marriage registration. I had given it to her without much thought, an old, slightly faded photocopy from years ago, the kind of document that meant nothing without the original to verify it. I had not thought of that photocopy since. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Tam, my former student, now working as a notary at the district office, a boy I remembered as a quiet, careful child who once stayed after class every day for a month, simply to finish reading a novel I had recommended to him. His voice, when he answered, carried the same gentle respect it always had. Teacher Lan, is everything all right? I explained what I had found, reading the notice aloud to him slowly, watching the silence stretch on the other end of the line as he listened. When I finished, there was a long pause before he finally spoke again, his voice careful, measured, the voice of someone choosing his words with great precision. Teacher Lan, he said quietly, I need you to bring me everything you have, every document, every paper related to this house, as soon as possible. And Teacher Lan, please, do not let anyone know you've discovered this yet. Not anyone. I looked out the kitchen window at the old garden Hoang used to tend, at the morning glory vines climbing along the back fence, exactly as they had on the morning he passed among them, and felt something cold settle quietly into my chest, something far heavier than mere worry. Because, if Bitch had used that photocopy to forge documents detailed enough to fool a bank, then whatever she was planning had already moved far beyond sweet suggestions over tea, and somewhere, hidden beneath the lowest drawer of an old wooden cabinet, sat the only thing in this entire house that could still prove exactly whose name truly belonged on that land. The question now was simply this. Did Bish already know it existed? Mr. Tam's office smelled of old paper and stale tea, the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. pushing warm air around the small room without actually cooling anything. I sat across from his desk, the small tin box resting on my lap like something fragile, while he carefully examined every document I had brought. He worked in silence for nearly 20 minutes, occasionally pausing to hold a page up toward the window light, comparing seals, checking signatures, the same careful, methodical patience I remembered from when he was 11 years old, checking his own handwriting 3 times, before turning in an essay. Finally, he set down the papers and looked at me, his expression carrying the particular heaviness of someone about to deliver news they wish they didn't have to. "Teacher Lan," he said slowly, "I made some calls this morning, quietly, to a colleague at the bank's regional office. I didn't give your name. I only asked general questions about a property under mortgage review at this address." He paused. "The loan was processed 4 months ago. 80 million dong, secured against this house, and the land it sits on." The number landed heavily in my chest, though I kept my face still, the same stillness I had practiced for 31 years in front of restless classrooms. "Whose name was on the loan application?" I asked. "That's the part I need you to prepare yourself for." He slid a printed copy across the desk toward me. "The application lists you as the property owner, with your signature authorizing the loan, but the funds were deposited into a separate account, opened the same week, under a different name." I looked down at the signature on the page. It was close, frighteningly close, the same slant to the L in Lan, the same small loop at the end of my family name. But I had signed enough report cards and parent letters over 3 decades to know my own hand intimately. The slight hesitation before the final stroke, the particular pressure I always applied to the last character. This was not my signature. This was someone who had studied my signature carefully, practiced it, and still gotten the ending wrong. "The account the money went into," I said quietly. "Whose name?" Mr. Tam hesitated, glancing toward the door as if to make sure it was fully closed. "The account belongs to a man named Kwok Hui. He's registered as a licensed real estate broker, though my colleague mentioned his name has come up before in 2 other complaints, both from elderly homeowners in different districts, both involving suspiciously fast property transfers." The name meant nothing to me directly, but the shape of what he was describing fit perfectly into place beside something else entirely, a memory I had nearly let slip past unnoticed. A man in a clean shirt and polished shoes, standing slightly behind Bitch in the doorway during the death anniversary, a man I had assumed was simply someone she'd brought along, perhaps a friend of her husband's. "There's something else," Mr. Tam continued, his voice dropping lower. "The mortgage paperwork includes a notarized witness statement confirming that you personally appeared at a different district office to sign these documents, accompanied by a family member who verified your identity. I have never set foot in any district office outside our own commune in over a decade," I said. "I know," he said quietly. "Which means whoever verified your identity that day either impersonated you or made arrangements with someone inside that office willing to look the other way for the right price." He looked at me directly now, his expression carrying the weight of a much older man than the boy I remembered staying late after class. "Teacher Lan, this is no longer a simple family disagreement over property. This is forged documentation, fraud against a financial institution, and very possibly, corruption involving a government office." I sat very still, feeling the full shape of what had happened settle slowly over me. The way floodwater rises, not all at once, but in patient, steady inches, climbing higher than you ever expected, until suddenly your feet are no longer touching dry ground. 80 million dong, borrowed against a house that was never offered as collateral, using a signature I never wrote, verified by an identity I never confirmed, deposited into the account of a man I had only glimpsed once, standing quietly in a doorway, while incense burned beside my husband's photograph. "Does the bank know yet that something is wrong?" I asked. "Not officially. The mortgage is still active. The payments, from what I can tell, have been made on time so far, likely to avoid drawing attention." He folded his hands on the desk, which tells me whoever did this is being patient. They're not trying to seize the house immediately. They're building something slower, more permanent. I thought of the businessman Bitch had mentioned months earlier, the one supposedly interested in buying the back portion of the land. I thought of her sudden visits, her careful questions, her eyes lingering too long on the altar room each time she sat in my house. "Teacher Lan," Mr. Tam said gently, breaking through my thoughts, "whatever you decide to do next, please be careful. If they realize you know, they may move faster than they originally planned." I looked down at the forged signature one final time, at the small loop at the end of my name that didn't quite match my own hand, and felt something shift inside me, quiet and resolute, like a door closing softly somewhere deep in the house. "Thank you, Tam," I said, gathering the papers carefully back into their folder. "I need to think very carefully now about what comes next." But as I stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun, the noise of the street rushing back around me, I already knew, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, exactly where I needed to begin. I did not confront Bitch. I did not call her, did not visit, did not give her the smallest indication that anything had changed. Instead, for the next 3 weeks, I became something I had not been in many years. A quiet, patient investigator, moving through my own life with the same careful attentiveness I once gave to grading essays late into the night, searching each line for what was hidden beneath the surface. I started with small things. I asked Mrs. Sao, casually, over tea one afternoon, whether she remembered the man who had accompanied Bitch to the death anniversary months earlier. "Oh, him," she said, wrinkling her nose slightly. I asked Bitch about him afterward. She said he was a business friend of her husband's, helping arrange something about land surveys nearby. I didn't think much of it. She paused, studying my face. "Why do you ask, sister?" "No reason," I said, smiling gently. "Just curious." I visited the commune office the following week, under the pretense of updating my household registration book, a task that genuinely needed doing, but conveniently gave me a reason to sit across from Mr. Fook, the clerk who had processed paperwork in this area for over 15 years, a man whose daughter I had once tutored for free during a difficult exam season. "Mr. Fuck," I said, after we finished the registration update, "I wonder if you remember processing anything related to my property in the past year. Loan documents, identity verifications, anything like that." He frowned slightly, flipping through an old logbook on his desk. "Let me check the records, Teacher Lan." After a few minutes, his frown deepened. "There's an entry here from 4 months ago, an identity verification request. But it's not signed by me. It's signed by Mr. Coy, who was only filling in temporarily that month while I was visiting my sick mother in Hugh. Is Mr. Coy still working here?" "No," Fook said slowly. "He left shortly after that month, said he found a better paying position somewhere in the city. I never heard from him again." He looked up at me, something uneasy crossing his face. "Teacher Lan, is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," I said, though we both understood. In the careful, unspoken way two people sometimes understand each other, that everything was very much not fine. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a small notebook, the same kind I once used to track which students needed extra help with their reading comprehension, and began writing down everything I had gathered. A forged signature, a fabricated identity verification, signed by a temporary clerk who had conveniently disappeared shortly afterward. A real estate broker with a history of suspicious complaints. A photocopy I had unknowingly handed over to Bick under the guise of a marriage registration favor. The pieces were beginning to form a shape, the way a poem reveals its full meaning only after you've read every line and let them settle together in your mind. I called Xavier. No, I called my nephew Kai instead, my younger sister's son, who worked in banking compliance in the city and had always had a sharp, careful mind for numbers and patterns. I explained everything carefully, reading him the loan details, the account name, the dates. "Auntie," he said, after a long pause, "I can look into Kwakui's broker license registration without raising any flags. Just routine due diligence checks happen all the time in my line of work. Give me a few days." 3 days later, he called back, his voice carrying a note of quiet satisfaction. I recognized immediately the same satisfaction I used to feel when a struggling student finally grasped a concept that had eluded them for weeks. Auntie. This Kwok Hai character has quite a history. 2 formal complaints filed against him in the past 3 years, both involving elderly property owners, both alleging unauthorized mortgage applications. Neither complaint resulted in charges, likely because the victims lacked documentation strong enough to prove forgery conclusively. But I have documentation, I said quietly. If what you're describing is accurate, you have far more than documentation. You have a forged signature that doesn't match your authentic one. A fraudulent identity verification connected to a clerk who vanished immediately afterward, and a financial paper trail leading directly to his account. Kai's voice grew more serious. Auntie, this isn't just a family dispute anymore. This is organized fraud. And from the pattern, it sounds like Kwok Hai specifically targets older homeowners who live alone. People he assumes won't have the resources or connections to fight back. I sat with that thought for a long moment after we hung up, looking toward the altar room where Hong's photograph watched over the quiet evening light filtering through the window. They had assumed I would be easy, a widow living alone, no children to advocate for her, simply a quiet old woman tending an altar and sweeping a courtyard. The kind of person whose silence could be mistaken for helplessness. They had read the surface of the water and assumed there was nothing underneath. I smiled faintly to myself, the same small smile I had given Bitch during the death anniversary. Except now, sitting alone in my quiet kitchen, there was no one left to witness it but Hong's photograph and the slow, steady curl of incense smoke rising toward the ceiling. Let them keep building, I thought. Let them grow comfortable in their certainty. The deeper they dig their foundation on borrowed ground, the harder the collapse will be when it finally comes. Bick arrived on a Saturday morning in midsummer, the heat already thick and heavy even before 9 o'clock, the cicadas screaming relentlessly from the old tamarind tree near the gate. She came alone this time, no dragon fruit, no soft opening pleasantries, her expression carrying the particular confidence of someone who believes the hardest part of their plan has already succeeded. Sister Lan, she said, settling onto the wooden bench without waiting to be invited. I think it's time we discussed the house seriously. I've spoken with a lawyer, and there are some matters we need to formalize. What matters? I asked, pouring tea with steady hands, though my mind was already moving 3 steps ahead of whatever she was about to say. The truth is, sister, this house has financial obligations now that you may not be fully aware of. There's a loan against the property, taken out to cover some family debts. She said this so smoothly, so naturally, that for a brief moment I almost admired the craftsmanship of the lie. The payments are becoming difficult to manage, and given the circumstances, my lawyer suggested it might be simplest if the property transferred fully into my name. That way, I can handle the loan directly, and you can continue living here without worrying about any of the paperwork. There it was, laid out plainly on the table between us, like a winning hand she believed no one else had seen coming. What loan, bitch? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level, the same tone I once used when a student attempted to convince me their dog had eaten a finished essay. She hesitated, just barely, a flicker of something crossing her face before she recovered her composure. It's complicated, sister. Family matters. Financial difficulties on my husband's side. I didn't want to burden you with the details, but the house was used as collateral to help us through a difficult period. I never signed any loan documents. You don't remember signing them, perhaps, she said quickly, too quickly. You've had so much on your mind since Hong passed, sister. It would be understandable if some details became unclear. I set down the teapot and looked at her directly, allowing the silence to stretch a moment longer than was comfortable, watching the way her eyes shifted slightly under the weight of it. Bick, I said quietly, I have never once, in my entire life, forgotten the things I have signed my name to. Something tightened in her jaw. Sister, I'm trying to help you. If this loan defaults, the bank will seize the property regardless of whose name is on it. At least if it transfers to me now, properly, legally, we can negotiate better terms, protect what's left of the family's interests. And the broker who arranged this loan, I said, watching her closely now, the man who accompanied you here during Huang's anniversary. Kwok Hui, I believe his name is. The silence that followed was brief, but absolute, the kind of silence that confirms more than any words could. How do you know that name? She asked, her voice losing some of its practiced warmth. I am old, bitch, not foolish. And I taught children for 31 years who thought their excuses were clever enough to fool me. None of them ever were. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping hard against the tile, the same sound it had made during her visit the previous spring. You don't understand the position you're in. The loan is real, sister, whether you signed it knowingly or not. The bank doesn't care about family disagreements. If payments stop, they will take this house, and you will have nothing. At least my way. You keep a roof over your head. And whose roof would that be? Exactly. Once the property transferred fully into your name. Her face flushed deep red, anger finally breaking through the careful mask she had maintained for nearly a year. You're an old woman living alone in a house too large for one person, clinging to a husband who's been dead for 3 years, lighting incense to a man who can't even hear you anymore. I'm trying to give you a way to keep dignity in your final years, and you're too stubborn to see it. I felt the words land, sharp and deliberate, designed to wound exactly the places she imagined were softest. But I had spent 3 decades learning that cruelty, when it finally reveals itself completely, is often the clearest evidence a person can offer against themselves. Thank you for your concern, bitch, I said calmly, rising to walk her toward the door. I will think carefully about everything you've said. She left without another word, her footsteps quick and hard against the dirt path, climbing onto her motorbike and disappearing down the road in a small cloud of dust. I stood in the doorway for a long while afterward, watching the dust settle slowly back onto the path, listening to the cicadas continue their endless screaming in the tamarind tree. She believed, truly believed, that she had already won, that the loan, the forged signature, the fabricated verification, had all worked precisely as planned, and that all that remained now was convincing a foolish old woman to sign away whatever was left. She had no idea that the foundation she was standing on, so confidently, so completely, was built entirely on borrowed ground that could collapse the moment someone simply asked to see what lay beneath it. I walked back inside, toward the altar room, and knelt down once more in front of the lowest drawer of the old wooden cabinet, my hands steady as I opened the small tin box hidden inside. Soon, I thought. Soon it will be time. The truth, when it finally arrived in full, came not from bitch, but from a folder Kai brought to me himself. Driving 4 hours from the city, on a Sunday afternoon, his face carrying an expression I had never seen on him before, somewhere between anger and heartbreak. We sat at the kitchen table, the late afternoon light slanting low through the window, painting everything in soft amber, while he laid out documents one by one, each page settling onto the table, like a stone added to a slowly sinking weight. Auntie, he said quietly, I need you to prepare yourself. What I found goes much deeper than a single fraudulent loan. He showed me bank records first, transfers moving from Kwok Hui's account into a joint account shared between him and bitch, opened 8 months ago, the timing aligning precisely with her first visit, asking about adding names to the property papers. They've been planning this for nearly a year, Kai said. Long before the loan was even processed. The early visits, the suggestions about adding her name to the papers, those weren't separate ideas, Auntie. They were the first attempt. When you refused, they moved to the second plan, the forged mortgage. I absorbed this slowly, feeling the careful architecture of betrayal reveal itself piece by piece, far more deliberate than I had allowed myself to imagine. There's more, he said, his voice growing quieter still. I found correspondence, emails between Kwok Hui and a property developer in the city, dated just 3 weeks ago. He slid the printed pages toward me. They're not just planning to take the house through the loan default, Auntie. They've already arranged a buyer, a developer planning to demolish the property and build a small apartment complex on the land, citing the location's value near the new road expansion. The words moved through me slowly, each one landing with its own particular weight. Demolish. The house Hoang's grandfather had built with his own hands. The altar room where 4 generations of incense smoke had risen toward the same dark wooden beams. The morning glory vines along the back fence where I had found my husband kneeling peacefully in his final moment. The plan, Kai continued, his voice carrying genuine difficulty now, was to let the mortgage default deliberately, after enough payments had been made to avoid raising suspicion with the bank. Once the bank moved toward foreclosure, Bitch intended to step forward as a concerned family member, offering to rescue the property by paying off the remaining debt, in exchange for full ownership transferred immediately into her name. Then, within weeks of taking ownership, she would sell the land to the developer, splitting the profit with Kwa Kui. I sat in absolute stillness, the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from the body's own protective instinct against a pain too large to process all at once. There's one more thing, Auntie, Kai said gently, sliding a final document across the table, his hand trembling slightly. I found this in correspondence between Bitch and her husband, dated around the time of your husband's anniversary. I read the message slowly, my eyes moving over each word, with the same careful, deliberate attention I once gave to reading aloud in front of a classroom. She has no children, no one to fight for her when the time comes. Once the house transfers, we tell her she can stay temporarily out of pity, just long enough to avoid suspicion before the demolition notice arrives. After that, it's not our problem where she goes. I set the page down on the table with hands that did not shake, though something inside my chest had cracked open completely, silently, the way old wood splits along an unseen fault line after years of quiet pressure. They had not simply wanted the house. They had planned, from the very beginning, to discard me entirely, to use kindness as a temporary mask only long enough to avoid drawing attention, before removing me from the only home I had left, the only place where Hong's voice still seemed to linger in the corners of every room. I thought of the morning glory vines, the way they had wrapped gently around the back fence for 30 years, climbing patiently, asking for nothing but a little sunlight and a place to hold on. I thought of Hoang, kneeling among them in his final moment, at peace in the home his family had built across 4 generations, and I thought of an old saying his grandmother used to repeat, something about bamboo bending in the storm but never breaking, its roots holding firm beneath the soil long after the wind has passed. I looked up at Kai, my voice steady, despite everything churning beneath the surface. Thank you for bringing me this. All of it. Auntie, I'm so sorry. I didn't want it to be true. Neither did I said quietly. But now that I know exactly what they intended, I understand precisely what I need to do. I rose slowly from the table and walked toward the altar room, where Hoang's photograph watched silently from its frame. The incense from earlier that morning long since burned down to ash. Whatever grief had cracked open inside me moments earlier began, slowly, to harden into something else entirely, something quiet, patient, and absolutely unshakable. They believed the storm they were building would simply wash me away. They had forgotten, completely, that bamboo planted deep enough never bends to anyone's convenience but its own. I did not sleep much that night, though the stillness in the house did not come from fear. It came from the particular, focused clarity that arrives only after grief has finished its first violent pass through the chest and settled into something colder, something far more useful. I sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight, the small oil lamp casting long shadows against the wall, organizing everything Kai had brought me alongside everything Mr. Tam had already confirmed: the forged signature, the fabricated identity verification, the bank records connecting Kwa Kui's account to the loan funds, the correspondence revealing the demolition plan, the developer's offer, and the chilling, casual cruelty of Bitch's own written words, dismissing me as a temporary inconvenience to be discarded once her purpose had been served. In the morning, I called Mr. Tam first. "Teacher Lan," he said, after I explained everything, his voice carrying the particular steadiness of someone who has just understood the full scope of a situation. This is no longer something we can address quietly between families. This is criminal fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy to seize property under false pretenses. We need to involve the district police and the bank's fraud investigation unit simultaneously. I understand, I said. But I want this handled carefully, Tam. I don't want them to have any warning before everything is laid out clearly, in front of people who cannot be persuaded to look away. What do you have in mind? I explained slowly, the plan forming itself with the same patient structure I once used to build a semester's worth of lessons. Each piece, building logically toward the next, nothing rushed, nothing left to chance. We would request a formal meeting at the notary office, framed carefully as the final step in finalizing the property transfer bitch herself had been pushing for. She would believe, walking in, that she had already won, that all that remained was a simple signature to complete what she and Kwakai had spent nearly a year constructing. She would have no idea that the room would also contain a representative from the bank's fraud division, an officer from the district police, Mr. Tam himself as the presiding notary, and several of my oldest neighbors, people who had known Huang's family for decades, invited under the simple explanation that their presence, as community witnesses, was customary for matters involving inherited property. And she would have absolutely no idea that I intended to bring the one thing she had never once considered, hidden carefully for years beneath an altar she had walked past 100 times without ever truly looking. Are you certain about this approach, Teacher Lan? Mr. Tam asked carefully. Once this begins, there's no quiet way to end it. It will become public, possibly even reach the local newspapers, given Kwok Hui's prior complaints. I am certain, I said. Some things are not meant to end quietly. Some things need to be seen clearly, by everyone, so they cannot ever be repeated against someone else. I spent the following days moving through my normal routine, exactly as I always had, sweeping the courtyard each morning, lighting incense at the altar each evening, speaking softly to Hoang's photograph about the small details of the day, careful never to give bitch the slightest indication that anything had shifted beneath the surface of our quiet, ordinary interactions. When she called 2 days later to confirm the meeting, eager and warm in a way that made my stomach turn slightly, I matched her tone perfectly, the same gentle, accommodating voice I had used with her for the past year. I think you're right, bitch, I said. Perhaps it is time to settle everything properly. Her relief was audible even through the phone, the particular relief of someone who believes the final obstacle has just dissolved completely. After we hung up, I walked once more to the altar room, kneeling in front of the lowest drawer, lifting the small tin box into my hands for what I knew would be one of the last times it would remain hidden. I held it gently, feeling its familiar weight, the weight of 4 generations resting quietly inside a few sheets of aging paper. Outside, the wind had shifted sometime during the afternoon, carrying with it the particular heaviness that always arrived before the summer's first real storm, the kind that bent the tamarind trees nearly sideways and sent everyone in the village rushing to secure their rooftops and gather their drying laundry before the sky finally broke open. I looked out toward the darkening clouds gathering low over the rice fields beyond the back fence and felt something settle quietly into place inside my chest. Calm, patient, and entirely without doubt. They had spent a year building their plans on borrowed ground, confident that an old woman's silence meant she had nothing left to defend herself with. 3 days from now, in a small notary office that smelled of old paper and stronger tea, they would finally learn exactly how deep that silence had always run. The storm outside was still gathering, but the one waiting for them inside that office had already arrived. The notary office sat at the end of a quiet street near the district market, a modest building with pale yellow walls and a row of plastic chairs along one side, the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, just as it had the day I first sat across from Mr. Tam with the small tin box on my lap. I arrived early, dressed simply in a dark brown ao ba ba, my hair pulled back into its usual low bun, the tin box wrapped carefully in a cloth bag, resting in my lap like something fragile and ordinary. Nothing that would draw a second glance. Bic arrived 15 minutes later, dressed in a new blouse I had never seen before, her makeup carefully done, Kwok Hui walking slightly behind her in the same polished shoes from the death anniversary, a leather folder tucked under his arm. She smiled when she saw me, warm and triumphant, the smile of someone who believes the final formality is simply a matter of minutes. "Sister Lan," she said, settling into the chair beside me. "Thank you for being so understanding about all of this. I promise, once everything is signed, things will be much simpler for both of us." "I'm sure they will," I said quietly. What she did not yet notice, settled quietly in the row of chairs along the far wall, were Mrs. Sao and 3 other neighbors from our lane, dressed neatly, sitting with the patient stillness of people who had been told only that their presence was required as community witnesses for a property matter. Nor did she notice the man near the door, in a plain collared shirt, who I knew to be Officer Dung from the district police, introduced to her earlier by Mr. Tam simply as another notary assistant, observing the proceedings. Nor did she register the woman quietly reviewing documents at the side table, Miss Hoa, from the bank's fraud investigation division, who had arrived 20 minutes before any of us, dressed plainly enough to blend into the background of an ordinary Tuesday morning. Mr. Tam called us forward to the main table, his expression carefully neutral, the same calm professionalism he had carried since he was a boy reading quietly at the back of my classroom. "Before we begin the property transfer documentation," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room, "I want to confirm, for the record, the full history of this property's financial standing, as is standard procedure for any transfer of this nature." Bic nodded eagerly, Kwok Hui sliding his leather folder across the table, with the confident ease of a man who had done this many times before. "Everything is in order," he said smoothly. "The existing mortgage will simply transfer along with the property into Mrs. Bic's name, streamlining the entire process." "I appreciate that," Mr. Tam said. "However, before we proceed, I'd like to address something that came to my attention recently. Mrs. Lan, would you mind showing everyone the original property registration documents you hold?" I reached into the cloth bag and lifted out the small tin box, opening it slowly, the hinges creaking softly in the quiet room. I withdrew the original land registration certificate, its red official seal still crisp despite its age, the paper slightly yellowed but completely intact, and placed it gently on the table. The room went still. "This is the original certificate of land use rights, issued to my husband's family and transferred properly into my name, following his passing, registered and stamped at the district land office," I said, my voice calm and clear. "I have kept it safely for the past 3 years. Kwok Hui's face shifted, just slightly, the confident ease draining from his expression as he glanced down at the document, then back at his own folder. "That's impossible," Bic said, her voice rising. "The registration we used to process the mortgage matches this property exactly." "It does match," Mr. Tam said calmly, "because the mortgage was processed using a photocopy of this same document. A photocopy Mrs. Lan lent to you several months ago for an unrelated matter, by your own account, to assist with your son's marriage registration." Miss Hoa stepped forward from the side table, placing a folder of her own beside Kwok Hui's. "I'd like to note, for the official record, that our fraud investigation division has confirmed the mortgage application submitted under Mrs. Lan's name was supported by an identity verification, signed by a temporary clerk, who left his position immediately following the transaction and has not been located since. The signature on the loan application has also been compared against several authenticated samples of Mrs. Lan's handwriting, provided voluntarily during this investigation, and does not match. The color had completely drained from Kwok Hui's face now, his eyes darting toward the door. "I think," I said quietly, into the heavy silence that followed, "it is time everyone here understood exactly what role I have actually played in my own home these past 3 years. I had spent my entire life in this house, listening more than speaking, watching more than asking, the way still water reflects everything happening above its surface, while revealing almost nothing of what moves quietly beneath it. Bitch had once told me, in front of the entire room gathered for Hong's death anniversary, that this house was never really mine, that I was simply a guest allowed to remain by my husband's mercy. She had been wrong about almost everything that day, but she had been most wrong about that one particular thing, because the proof sitting now on the table in front of everyone was the same proof that had been sitting quietly beneath my husband's altar the entire time, exactly where it had always belonged, in the hands of the person whose name was always meant to hold it. For a long moment, nobody moved. The ceiling fan continued its slow, steady turning overhead, and somewhere outside, a vendor's bicycle bell rang twice as it passed along the street. "This is a misunderstanding," Kuo Kui said finally, gathering his folder with hands that were not quite steady. "I simply processed the paperwork that was brought to me. If there's an issue with the documentation, that falls on whoever supplied it." "And who supplied it to you, Mr. Hui?" Officer Deng asked, stepping forward now, his earlier role as a quiet observer dissolving into the firm authority he had been carrying all along. Kuo Kai's eyes flicked toward Bitch, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Bitch caught the look, and her face hardened immediately, the warmth she had carried into the room evaporating completely. "Don't look at me like that," she snapped at him. "You told me this was simple. You said the verification would hold up, that nobody checks these things this carefully. I told you it would work if you didn't draw attention to it." Kuo Kai shot back, his composure cracking entirely now. "You're the one who insisted on rushing the timeline, pushing for the transfer before the developer's deadline, because you said the buyer wouldn't wait." The two of them continued, voices rising, each sentence revealing another piece of the arrangement neither had intended to confirm so completely in front of a room full of witnesses. The developer's offer, the agreed split of the profits, the plan to let the mortgage quietly default before stepping in with a rescue that was never meant to rescue anything at all. Miss Hoa was writing steadily now, her pen moving across her notepad without pause, capturing each admission as it fell carelessly from their mouths. 80 million dong, Bitch said suddenly, turning toward me, her voice sharp with desperation now rather than confidence. "That's all we needed, sister. You have this whole house, this whole property, and you would have kept living here regardless. We weren't trying to—" "You wrote," I said quietly, "that I had no children to fight for me. That once the property transferred, I would be allowed to stay only long enough to avoid suspicion before the demolition notice arrived. That after that, it would no longer be your problem where I went." The room went silent again, completely silent, except for the soft scratch of Miss Hoa's pen. Bick's face went pale. "Where did you find that?" "It doesn't matter where I found it," I said. "What matters is that you wrote it, and that everyone in this room has now heard exactly what you intended for me." Mrs. Cao, sitting along the far wall, made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob, her hand pressed against her mouth. The other neighbors shifted uncomfortably, their faces carrying the particular disgust reserved for betrayal that strikes closest to the bone. Family, turning against family with a calculation cold enough to plan a person's quiet removal from their own home. "You don't understand what it's like," Bitch said, her voice cracking now, tears gathering at the edges of her eyes, though whether from genuine remorse or simply the realization of how thoroughly she had been caught, I could not say with certainty. "Watching Huang inherit everything while I left with nothing. Watching you live comfortably in this house for 30 years while I struggled. I deserved something too." "You could have asked," I said softly. "At any point in the past 3 years, you could have simply asked me for help, honestly, and I would have given whatever I reasonably could. Instead, you chose to forge my signature, steal my identity, and plan to remove me entirely from the only home I have left." Officer Deng stepped forward then, his voice carrying the formal weight of procedure. "Mr. Hui, Mrs. Bick, given the evidence presented today, including the forged documentation, the fraudulent identity verification, and the recorded statements made in this room, I'll need both of you to accompany me to the station for formal questioning regarding fraud and document forgery." Kuo Kui, attempted one final protest. Something about needing to consult a lawyer first. But Officer Dung's expression made clear. The conversation had already moved beyond negotiation. Bick turned to me one last time, before they led her toward the door, her face a complicated mixture of anger and something that might have been shame, though it arrived far too late to soften anything that had already been said. "I'm still family, sister," she said quietly. "Whatever happens now, that doesn't change." I looked at her for a long moment, thinking of Hong kneeling peacefully among his morning glory vines, of incense rising steadily toward dark wooden beams every evening for 3 years, of an old saying about water that runs quiet, running deepest, never once promising it would also run forgiving. "Family," I said finally, "is not a word you use to explain away what you tried to take from someone. It's a word you earn, every day, through how you treat the people who trust you. You stopped earning it the moment you decided my home was simply something to be divided between yourself and a stranger." She had nothing left to say to that. Officer Dung led her and Kwok Hai out through the front door, the morning sunlight catching briefly on the metal of the doorframe before it swung quietly shut behind them. The room remained still for a long moment afterward, everyone absorbing the full weight of what had just unfolded. Mr. Tam finally broke the silence, his voice gentle. "Teacher Lan, the original registration remains exactly as it should, under your name, fully legitimate. I'll personally ensure the fraudulent mortgage is formally voided once the investigation concludes." "Thank you, Tam," I said, carefully returning the certificate to its tin box, the same box that had waited patiently beneath an altar for 3 quiet years, holding its single, simple truth, until the moment it was finally needed. 6 months passed before everything settled into its final, quiet shape. The investigation confirmed everything Kai and Miss Hoa had uncovered: the forged signature, the fraudulent identity verification, the planned property seizure timed deliberately around my isolation as a widow with no children to advocate on my behalf. Kwok Hai faced formal charges for document forgery and financial fraud, his broker's license permanently revoked, the 2 prior complaints against him finally given the weight they deserved once mine joined them. Bick received a suspended sentence, given her limited role compared to Kwok Hui's, along with a court order to repay her portion of the fraudulent loan funds, a debt that would follow her for years. I did not ask for more than that. I did not pursue additional punishment, did not demand she lose everything, the way she had once planned for me to lose everything. Some people in the village thought me too gentle for it, Mrs. Sao included, who muttered more than once that bitch deserved far worse for what she had attempted. But 31 years of teaching had taught me something perhaps more valuable than punishment. That the truth, once spoken clearly and completely, in front of those who needed to hear it, often carries its own lasting weight, far heavier than anything a courtroom could additionally impose. The mortgage was formally voided. The property registration remained exactly where it had always belonged, in my name, the same name that had been on it since the week after Hoang's funeral, when his lawyer first helped me complete the transfer, with paperwork that required no forgery at all, only the simple, documented truth of a marriage that had lasted 41 years. I never sold the back portion of the land to any developer. Instead, in early autumn, I spoke quietly with Mr. Tam about a different kind of paperwork altogether, the kind that required no urgency, no hidden motives, only careful consideration of what Hoang would have wanted. I formally registered the property to pass, upon my own passing, to Kai's young daughter, my grandniece, a quiet, serious 6-year-old named Mai, who had visited twice that year with her father, who had sat patiently beside me at the altar one evening while I lit incense, asking thoughtful questions about the photograph of the grandfather she had never met. "Why do you talk to him if he can't hear you?" she had asked. Her small face tilted curiously toward the dark wooden frame. "Because some things are not about being heard," I told her. "Some things are about remembering correctly, so that what mattered to someone doesn't disappear simply because they're no longer here to protect it themselves." She had nodded slowly, the way a child nods when an answer settles somewhere deeper than immediate understanding, and reached up to place her own small stick of incense carefully into the burner beside mine. I did not become wealthy from any of this. I gained no additional money, no expanded property, nothing beyond what had always rightfully belonged to me in the first place. What I gained instead was something far less measurable and far more permanent. The quiet certainty that this house, built by 4 generations of careful, patient hands, would continue forward exactly as Hoang had always wished. Gentle, protected, and rightfully placed. On the evening after the paperwork was finalized, I sat alone in the altar room as the last light of day faded slowly through the wooden shutters, lighting incense the way I had every evening for 3 years, watching the thin smoke curl upward into the dark beams above. I thought of Bix's voice that day during the death anniversary, sharp and certain, telling me I was merely a guest in a house that was never truly mine. I thought of how completely silence had answered her, not through argument, not through anger, but through patience, through the simple, unshaken certainty of someone who already held everything she needed to prove the truth, waiting only for the right moment to let it speak for itself. Hoang's grandmother had told him once, and he had passed the words to me on a quiet morning years ago, that water running quiet always runs deepest, that people mistake stillness for emptiness at their own peril, never understanding what depths might be waiting patiently beneath an undisturbed surface. I understood it completely now, in a way I never could have, before everything that happened, before a forged signature, and a stolen photocopy, and a desperate, calculated betrayal, taught me exactly how deep that stillness inside me had always been capable of running. The incense smoke rose steadily toward the ceiling, the same patient rhythm it had followed every evening since Hong's passing, carrying with it, as it always had, the quiet, unspoken promise that some things, properly tended and patiently protected, are never truly lost, no matter how fiercely someone else might try to claim them as their own. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the evening settle gently around the old house, and let myself simply rest in the stillness Hoang had once tried to teach me to trust. Still water, I thought, runs deepest of all. And it had finally, after everything, found its way safely home. If you've ever felt overlooked by your own family, dismissed as someone whose time has passed, whose voice doesn't carry the same weight it used to, I want you to know something. Quiet does not mean weak. The people who underestimate you today are often the ones who will be most surprised by what you've been carrying all along. If this story meant something to you, give it a like, and subscribe for more stories just like it. Have you ever had a moment in your own life where someone underestimated you, only to be proven completely wrong? Tell me about it in the comments below.